Hi, Mike. I want to talk with you today about beliefs about 9/11, about what happened on 9/11, and why beliefs are so different and still so, in some ways, you know, difficult to talk about, that people have a hard time. I find that it's difficult for me to talk with others who are friends of mine, even about what I believe and what they believe. And I think it's very interesting that there is so much anxiety about these differences, because in some way that anxiety forecasts anxieties about other differences, differences in regard to vaccine mandates, differences in regard to looking at issues surrounding various kinds of anti-racism, racism. There have been conversations that have been so difficult to have in North America, and it seems to me they started with 9/11. So I want to ask you what you believe happened on 9/11, why you believe it, and I know you made a documentary about it. And so a little bit about what motivated you to make that documentary. And then we're going to look at really some of the issues that have to do with how people believe something to be true or not true.
I remember that morning, I got a call from a friend of mine who said, "Turn on the TV, a plane just flew into the World Trade Center." And I remember the shock, just almost immediately went into a kind of trance, and everything seemed to move in a little bit of slow motion. And I turned on the TV, and at that point, all you could see was smoke coming out of one of the buildings, and people were still trying to figure out if it was a big plane, a small plane. People didn't know. And I remember my friend said, "Who do you think did this?" And I remember my first thought that morning was, to me, it wasn't a shock that there may be people in the world who would want to attack us.
So you immediately thought, or you associated this to terrorism. You did not think accident. You did not think, oh, something just happened to you. Your sort of first thought was, this is intentional.
Yes, that these things always seemed to not touch us directly. And
Uh-huh.
then on that morning, here it is reaching out, and it's happening here. What was shocking, I began to meet people who said they immediately started to question what happened, and they didn't believe the unfolding narrative. And I remember, like, my perception of them when I heard them say this at that time was another shock, like just utter disbelief. How could you think that this is something other than what you just saw happen?
Mm-hmm. So you were believing the unfolding narrative, and then you met some people who were not, and you wondered, well, how could there be a gap for anybody? And I have to say that for myself, when I saw the videos at the very beginning, I thought it might be an accident. Then with the other plane, I knew it wasn't an accident. And as the narrative unfolded through media, I started studying Islam. I mean, I didn't know much about Islam. I didn't know what the motivations might. I mean, I certainly knew Americans were hated all over the place, and I could understand how, people from Afghanistan, for example, might hate us. I could understand how the Saudis could be a part of that, but I didn't understand the beliefs of Islam. So that's where I went. I went to try to study some Islam, understand it, get an overview. I end up reading about it mostly in the New Yorker, listening to Sam Harris, whatever. And so I was kind of wrapped up in that rather than in looking at actually what happened. And so I later began to look at what happened. And I began to hear also that there were different kinds of narratives. And then there was also a report of not only the plane flying into the Pentagon, but the plane that crashed in Shanksville. But there was also, I remember a plane that was flying somewhere over Manhattan, and there was something wrong with the tail of the plane. And I remember somehow there was some other kind of crash. And
yeah, I can't believe you've brought that up. I don't recall anyone else ever remembering that within a month or two after 9/11, an Airbus crashed in Queens and took out an entire block of houses. And the explanation was the pilot allegedly pushed too hard on the rudder during what they called wake turbulence. That was the whole explanation.
Well, I think one reason I do recall it is that it began then there was a way that it disappeared from the national narrative that made me concerned about what we were learning in the national narrative. It's like if a large crash gets eliminated from the story so quickly, we don't really know why it crashed. It was something about the tail of the plane was what I recall, but there wasn't nearly the explanation that we'd gotten for other kinds of crashes. So I began to think there's something about this narrative that's manipulated. And that was when I began to sort of look from a different view. I wasn't at that moment, I would say, suspicious of the larger narrative. I was suspicious of how things were coming and going. And then I was spending most of my time trying to understand Islam anyway, which is a complicated religion and requires a lot of study. I never really gave it due study, but that shift over then to having some concern about the narrative, I began to look into various sources eventually. I think you had a much bigger transformation, and I'd like to hear about what happened and what led you to making the documentary, and then what you came to believe, as a result of making the documentary.
It wasn't really until March of 2003 when I came across people having a discussion about whether or not sophisticated investors in the global financial markets had foreknowledge of the impending attacks because they made bets on the world's financial markets, on the stock markets, on the put options markets. As I began to look at what these people were saying, I thought, this is going to be very easy to debunk. My first thoughts were these people are really a little crazy. And I went to the Chicago Board of Options Exchange website, and they had the data. Because it was new to the internet, they put the data online for all their options. I just remember recoiling because the bets were only made on United and American. They didn't make them on Delta. They didn't make them on Southwest or any of the large Continental. None of the other big airlines had these disproportionately large bets made that the stocks would tank. And at first I was trying to debunk what they were saying. And now I'm looking at evidence, which to me it's incontrovertible. These are trades that have happened. There's a footprint. This isn't my interpretation of the footprint because there are other financial experts who are also following this story. That was the beginning of my eyes being open to something that was invisible one moment before. And all of a sudden, I'm now seeing things that I wasn't seeing and I mean, this is March and April of 2003. And I start reading just mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, and I'm finding all of these, a lot of articles that are contradicting the beliefs that I've already formed based on the narrative that much of the government has been putting out. We were unprepared. Nobody ever thought they could use planes as weapons. Our radar was outward pointing to defend ourselves from the Soviet Union, even though the Cold War and the Soviet Union no longer existed. And for 48 hours, I became entirely untethered from reality, where all I did was sit in a chair and read. And then on the second day, I began to notice that the Washington Post article I read yesterday no longer exists today.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was thinking of Orwell, whoever controls the past controls the future. And now I'm seeing in real time something that I wouldn't have ever believed if somebody else told me, that the New York Times or the Washington Post or some of these mainstream media outlets are deleting articles. And I said, I guess I have an obligation now to try to save all of these articles to preserve the actual reporting on facts that people are trying to erase right in front of my eyes. And I was in a trauma response. I was in a deep shock.
Because up until then, you had not given, I guess, great sort of credence, maybe some credence, but not great credence, to the idea that the New York Times would intentionally distort the truth, or that the government would report things and then manipulate those reports. You perhaps you had thought you sometimes were being lied to, but for good reason. And so because of, top secret sort of protection, but you wouldn't have thought there was something such sort of a massive manipulation of the truth. Is that, or of the facts, let's say?
I consider the New York Times the de facto paper of record.
Yes.
So to catch them manipulating or shifting a narrative, and as I decided to go on my own investigation because I just needed to know what was going on. I couldn't make sense of my country and how I fit into it and what was going on. And eventually I was on the front line of, catching the New York Times intentionally manipulating the public. When the federal government came out with their final report on the collapse of a third building, which was never hit by a plane, it was the Salomon Brothers building, or Building 7. The lead investigator for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Shyam Sunder, held a press conference, and the New York Times was there reporting on it. He said, not only were there's no reports of first-person testimony to this. If the buildings had been demolished using explosions, there would be dozens or hundreds of eyewitnesses who would describe hearing explosions or describe seeing ignition patterns going up the building. And the New York Times reporter published his account word for word in their report on his press conference. After 9/11, the city of New York under Giuliani went to every first responder they could locate who was there that day and took their first-person testimony of their experience. The New York Times, during the Bloomberg administration, requested those testimonies. The Bloomberg administration refused to release them. The New York Times sued and won. And then they published all those testimonies in which firefighters explicitly describe and make comparisons to Las Vegas hotel demolitions. So for the New York Times to forget that they sued the city for the very evidence that the lead investigator claimed didn't exist, and then they didn't publish that, was a clear manipulation.
At this point, you're coming into a clearer recognition that this information has been intentionally manipulated and that the general public is being misled. And you have been collecting enough of your own information to feel that you have the evidence.
Yeah. And so the
Hmm.
question that kept arising for me was, how can people deny what their own eyes are showing them?
And so you began to recognize that people were not looking with their sort of, I would say, typical eyes at this material that they were seeing repeatedly. They were swept up into perhaps the narrative and the kind of media narrative, so that when they saw the videos, they weren't really seeing in reality what was happening. They were seeing what they imagined to be happening. And what they imagined to be happening was that the buildings came down as a result of being hit by the planes. And even though one of the buildings hadn't been hit by anything, there was still some idea that somehow it must have come down as a result of the other crashes, I guess.
What I experienced at the time is there was a clash of worldviews. How do people see reality so differently? How do they begin to evaluate their own beliefs? And like the questions that we had discussed, those 5 questions related to the witch trials about how questioning our beliefs, how capable am I of changing my own beliefs?
Yeah,
Of
I mean, those are the witch trials of J.K. Rowling is where
yes,
the 5 questions came up, and they are questions about how we entertain what's true for ourselves, even, or in relation to others. Do we entertain doubts about what we believe? What kind of evidence do we have, and what would allow us to change our mind based on evidence? How do we articulate our positions? Could we articulate the position of someone who disagrees with us? And then, when you are attacking ideas or are in a debate, are you attacking the people? Are you attacking their ideas? And then ultimately, and this I think is still critical for 9/11, do you cut off your relationships from people who have different beliefs than you have? And of course, that happened not only with 9/11, but with a number of national incidences that followed after 9/11, where families split apart, there were estrangements. So I think one thing that's important is to recognize that when 2, 3, 4, 100 people see something, they don't see the same thing. They see what they see first person through their own eyes. They hear what they hear through their own ears. And then they interpret very much through their memories, through their desires, through their, understanding of how you establish what's true. So there couldn't really be an incident that was as big and terrifying as 9/11 and have everybody have a consensus about what happened. And even when it comes to physical evidence is interpreted. And so, one group can interpret it in a certain way and another group in another way. So, by the very nature of this large event that terrified people, having a consensus was going to be very difficult. I think what occurred over time as you came out with your documentary and as people began to suspect that there was manipulation of a national storyline, that then it seemed very difficult for people to have conversations in that atmosphere that showed true curiosity. Like, if it is the case that, let's say, a physicist or an engineer can tell me that those buildings had to have been demolished through explosions because of the way they collapsed, and I listen to that argument, then how can I ask questions in a way that would help me establish through my own curiosity what I believe, not what the physicist believes, not what the engineer believes, but how do I establish what I believe in taking on that evidence? But even having a conversation like that, where somebody could ask questions of somebody's findings and then follow a process of inductive or deductive reasoning, that wasn't possible. It was not possible because there was somehow too much terrifying emotion to allow people to have dialogue or conversation that would be essentially a way of trying to understand what, any individual might take away from conflicting evidence that was coming out. So I guess I'm wanting you to give us the name of your documentary, tell us what year it came out, and then how your life was affected by the things that you found out and what you believe to be true now, from what you know over the years and from the documentary, and how you would like people to be able to ask or be interested in finding the truth for themselves, that knowing that there won't be a consensus on something that's this terrifying because everybody has a different experience of it, but that through a process of curiosity, inquiry, conversation, people can come to a point where at least there can be a sense of, okay, this is what I believe. This is how I see it. And that process has not happened. It's been an avoidance of talking about the different kinds of evidence and the different kinds of beliefs. And so instead of having these open conversations, these real dialogues, we've just had a lot of people saying, I can't talk about that. If you believe it that way, I can't talk with you about it.
The full name of the documentary is Improbable Collapse, The Demolition of Our Republic.
And did you give the name? Did you name it?
I named it because what I saw as I was interviewing people, I would always ask the first question always was, where were you on that day? It was as if people went into a trance as they remembered where they were. And then there was this common theme that came out. It was just like watching a movie, or they would say a horror movie. Those clouds chased people down the street like monsters. And that was such a common experience that it helped me to begin to understand how deeply wounding to the emotional body of this country and who we thought we were, how we perceived the government's role in keeping us safe, and in the absence of their ability to protect and defend us, the grasping for trying to make sense of something that was so incomprehensibly complicated and large. And so I noticed that in other activists I was meeting, their marriages and relationships were falling apart. Families got split. I know that you had some experience of this on your own, where people within families would just say, if you're going to think that, I can't really have any relationship with you anymore.
Well, there's this issue that in addition to the issues that surround perception, that is how we see what we see and how we make sense of it, that there's not something out there that is the thing and that gives us the information, but rather that we see something based on what we already believe. There is another piece of research that's important in this conversation, which is in the book Being Wrong, which is a book. The subtitle is Adventures in the Margins of Error, but it's a book by a journalist who reviews research on all sorts of things having to do with perceptions and conclusions we make and beliefs we have. And one point that she makes that I think is important in regard to 9/11 it is very difficult for people to inhabit the space of actually being wrong. At the moment that you feel that you were wrong about something that's very important to you, like if you were wrong in believing that your spouse, let's say, spent the evening with friends, and actually the spouse spent the evening in a hotel with a lover, and you see the evidence that you were wrong, it is very hard for you to inhabit a space in which you continue to be so wrong about your spouse. You very quickly have to shift that space into, I always knew she was a cheater. I always knew he was a cheater. I could tell this. Basically, you have to shift over to how I was actually right, but didn't pay attention to my own information. Because if you stay in the space of, I was wrong and I was really wrong, in a sense, your whole world falls apart. All of the things, the ways that you saw them previously, the way you heard them previously, all of that is undermined. And if there's nothing that replaces it, you're really alienated. And you can't, in fact, participate in your life anymore. You'll have a major depressive episode, if you want to call it that, or you'll feel like you need to take yourself out of existence. So that this whole issue of being wrong about something that you fundamentally believe is very difficult for humans to wrestle with. And I think 9/11 is one of those things. Like, once, if an individual like myself wants to begin to question the truth of the government's reports, the truth of the major media, the truth of even the videos we were seeing, if I want to question those things, then I have to be prepared to question a very long line of things that I have previously believed, that I may be staking my identity on, like, for example, my politics, my political identity. I might be staking my identity as, an American. And so the repercussions of believing something that goes against the sort of mainstream narrative in relation to 9/11 were pretty great. I mean, because it was happening in our present moment. It wasn't something that, happened a while ago that we can now bring into question, look at the evidence and so on. It was unfolding as we were trying to understand it. And then various things happened, like that plane that went down over Queens, or various other things that never got explained. And I think that the issue about how we believe what we believe is one that is very complicated, and a good study of that issue is what happened with 9/11, and even what happened with your documentary, that though you showed physical evidence, though you never overclaimed to know things that you didn't know, you were only speaking about what you knew to be the case. You weren't speculating. As you said, you recognized this is a very complex set of circumstances. There's a lot I don't understand about it. But the things that I do understand, I'm really willing to stake my reputation on, because I've gotten to the bottom of the facts, and the facts are hard to manipulate. However, even with all of that, the idea that somebody is going to give up their beliefs about the New York Times, or their beliefs about the government, or their beliefs about how safe we are, or how we stand in the world, it would be a far reach for some people to be willing to go into being that wrong. When being wrong is really a state of, I would say, kind of chaotic darkness in which your world can fall apart if you're deeply wrong about what you take to be fundamental. And I think 9/11 introduced some of that territory for people.
Oh, at so many levels, I think that is true. When we would have a dialogue or a conversation, people would say to me, I'm not comfortable going there. I really don't. If what you're saying is true, I don't want to know. And I always made sure that I thanked them for their honesty.
I think it's not unusual if it's going to this idea that I could be wrong about the New York Times, or I could be wrong about the country, or I could be wrong about what I believe in my own politics. If it causes a real undermining of a fundamental belief, being wrong leads to experience that is very alienating. And so it can't be taken lightly. The idea that you were raising questions that the individual may have been afraid to even look at, and then to have facts to back up your answers made it more threatening even. As you have had years now since your documentary came out, lots of conversations with people, as you and I have been talking in some of our recent podcasts about stage development differences among adults, and how some people who are at a stage of development that is more self-protective, that is more conformist in the sense that they have to believe in the reality of group rules, that those rules are what actually allow them to feel at ease in their lives, that those kinds of adults, even if they have a modicum of self-awareness and a modicum of a recognition that they do have conflicts within themselves, but it's really the majority of adults in the United States who are at these conformist and pre-conformist positions developmentally, they do not have the capacity to ask questions about their own beliefs and to examine the evidence for their beliefs, because they don't have the direct experience of their own inner conflicts. They don't have a direct experience that they can believe multiple things that are in conflict with each other, and that they have to examine how that works and what they really do believe to come to a position that is a position of evidence, and to be clear about your assumptions, to know why you think the way you think, where you start to examine your own opinions and so on. So the majority of people can't make this self-examination. And I'm going to read these 5 questions that we were talking about, that these questions were brought up by Megan Phelps Roper in the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. And she asked these questions as a way of asking J.K. Rowling, can you examine your own beliefs about what has happened to you? And Megan Phelps Roper said she used the questions to examine her beliefs, as she essentially saw herself as a kind of very wrong person in relation to some of the positions she had taken as an evangelical Christian. When she began to realize she was wrong, and it was a very big identity crisis for her, she then used these questions to examine her beliefs. And I'm just going to read the questions. Are you capable of entertaining real doubts about your beliefs? Can you give evidence you would need to see in order to change your mind? Can you articulate the position of your opponents in a way that your opponents would recognize? Are you attacking ideas or the people who hold them? And finally, do you cut off from close relationships with people that you disagree with? And, if you don't cut off, why don't you cut off? And if you do, why do you cut off? Now, those questions, which sound like reasonable self-examination questions, they cannot be reasonably entertained by the majority of adults in our country, because the majority of people don't think that they themselves have contradictory beliefs that they would need to examine. They believe that they know the truth of things, that they can feel the truth, that they know what's true, they know what's not true. And they may also believe then they belong to a group that has authorities that also knows, and that they want to trust experts and authorities. They don't want to think that they know everything. So why would they want to examine, their own beliefs? So that's the majority of people. And then beyond that majority is another group of adults who become very aware that they have conflicting points of view in their own minds, that it is a responsibility for them to examine what they believe so that they can understand their own assumptions, their own logic, their own evidence, and that then another group that even recognizes that that's true of all people, and so that each person does have a right to have beliefs of their own, to examine their own conscience, to say what they believe, that there's no overriding authority that knows everything and that people can just subscribe to. And then you've got an even more refined sense of that among some adults who are very, very interested in all of the differences that humans bring to the table when it comes to beliefs about the truth, and also know that, there are many different ways that all of us can be persuaded to see things this way or that. So you've got adults that fall across this whole sort of spectrum, from just believing the authority and the group and believing that they know the truth and they don't have to examine it, to adults that understand the nuance and see the nuance of beliefs, perceptions, differences, and so on, and recognize and respect and have compassion for the ways that humans have to essentially struggle to really understand what's going on, because we're not bound to our instincts and we're not gods. I mean, we don't know automatically what to do, and we don't have omniscience. So we're kind of in this space where we're always having to determine, argue, debate in order to see the truth. But again, that's a kind of minority of people who recognize that that is a reality. So, when you're getting something like a documentary about evidence that goes against the mainstream story, you're appealing to an audience that has very different ways of understanding your appeal. And I'm sure you eventually saw that.
The people who would come to a screening were usually pretty curious and were already questioning.
Right.
What was interesting is they would always bring either a friend or a family member that they were trying to convince. And to what you were speaking to earlier, that we've been discussing in our podcast, Waking Up Is Not Enough, that relates to this stage development theory, is that, for me, 9/11 became this, as we've discussed, an ontological shock. It became this really deeply personal crisis of identity. It was a great challenge for me to separate out my belief in a kind of beneficial parent in the form of a government that is out to protect me and keep me safe. This was something that was such a deep core belief of mine. I had a lot at stake for wanting to believe what my government was telling me.
That crisis you went through at the beginning that was like a 2-year crisis. That was the identity crisis of being wrong. That when you realize that you're so wrong, you were so wrong about what you believed, and what you believed was so fundamental to your sense of security that it causes a difficult crisis to recognize how wrong you have been. If, for example, an individual hasn't responded to these issues of what you could call distortion of truth, starting with the Kennedy assassination, and all along they have continued to try to believe that the government is telling us the truth, that the laws are in place to protect us, that the major newspapers are reporting the news we need. If that belief is in place over time, and it has gone on for 60 years, to give it up would need to give up really all sorts of things. Everything gets connected to everything else over time in terms of not wanting to be wrong. That you can't be wrong about everything, because if you are wrong about everything, then you really haven't ever been really paying attention as a human being. I mean, you hardly have been here at all. So I think that issue of being wrong, became a kind of forefront issue with 9/11. It started to be, I think, with Kennedy's assassination, but there was a way that 9/11 was so dramatic and so in everyone's face and so repeated and so on. There were many things that you would have to overlook not to feel that your government was doing you wrong.
When I was at the last training in Vermont, I was sitting in the room when everybody went to lunch with two people having lunch. And one of them asked me something about 9/11. And I began to tell them just a little bit of my personal story. And I remember this person looked around the room and then said to me, I don't really feel comfortable. We're not allowed to talk about this.
Wow.
Aren't you concerned that people will hear you saying this?
That issue, of being wrong, I think
Yes.
is very fundamental, very existential. And whatever it is that we stake our identity on, if something comes along to undermine it in a primary way, we have to be at a fairly high level or complex level or nuanced level of development to take on the whole thing of being wrong, of undermining our identity, and then inquiring into how we believe what we believe. And so in a certain way, it's not so remarkable that a majority of people don't want to go through that process or cannot go through that process, because it is a strenuous process. And it does mean that you learn, and just as Megan Phelps Roper talked about it, you learn that you have to work with your own mind and your own conscience about what you believe, and that as you get some sort of skill or technique for doing this, it does get easier, but it doesn't get easier on the social level, on the level of trying to talk to other people about how to do this kind of examination of what you believe, because there are going to be always a majority of people who do not know what you're talking about. And it doesn't matter how clear you are about the evidence, because they cannot enter into the conversation. They just cannot make sense of what you're saying. And I think that is a very hard truth for human beings, that we could have these kinds of differences that divide us from each other, even in regard to evidence.
I loved the framing of the question in learning about how I was wrong about things I believed, and how I was so attached to my sense of confidence and knowingness in how the world was, And that when that got stripped away and it became this crisis of identity, it's easy to forget how my desire to be right, to feel secure and safe, really has a powerful influence over what I'm willing to believe.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so, and
exactly.
I've really enjoyed doing the episodes that we've done in our podcast together. And I want to thank you for being willing to approach 9/11 in this context.
I'm going to say that I've really enjoyed this. I hope that we haven't undermined anybody's relationship to their own belief structure, but I do hope we've opened some sort of understanding of why it's so hard to talk about what happened on 9/11 and how dedicated you have been to helping people examine their beliefs about what was true, and how you've done it from a position, I think, of great modesty, great dedication, and tremendous sort of documentation of evidence and of facts and narratives from people that were there and investigated it. If it's a great service to anyone who does want to examine their own beliefs about what's true.
Well, thank you.